Moving on with the show, I would now like to invite the speakers for our next session. Please join me. Shoshana, Sreya, and Lula, can you unmute yourself and put on your videos? I see Shoshana, I see Sreya, and Lula. Hi, welcome, guys.
Great to be here.
This is Ali. Hello, everyone.
Hi,
So
nice to be here.
So Lauren had to drop today due to a last-minute emergency, so I've stepped in to fill her big shoes. I know this is the first time we're meeting, so a brief background on myself. My name is Vaishali. For the first 6 years of my professional life, I was the editor for Nepal's leading women's lifestyle and business magazines. So my introduction to fashion happened right at the start of my career. It also helped that Saloni, founder of Agati, is my childhood friend, whom I remember throughout school to have had a penchant for design and aesthetics. In the latter part of my career, 12 years to be exact, I moved on to the development sector, working with leading think tanks globally. There was a lot of discussion around government interventions. So, I've spent the last 10 years looking at policy. How do we remove policy barriers that keep small enterprises small? So that's a quick introduction. Great to meet all of you. I think this topic that we have today, artisan to entrepreneur, how do we get started, sustain and grow, is of particular interest to me, as it may be for many of you present here today. We have with you, I'm going to do quick introductions in the interest of time. I know, Shoshana, you have to leave soon. We have with us, ladies and gentlemen, Sreya Mozumdar, Executive Director of Craftmark, AIACA India. Shoshana Stewart, CEO of Turquoise Mountain, established by His Highness the Prince of Wales, and Lula Mena, founder Lula Mena. We will have 10 minutes of question and answer later on, so please keep typing your questions in that small tab that you see on your screens. So let me get started by posing a first question to our speakers. In the fast-paced world today, where everything happens at a click of a button, where consumers want everything to be quick, simple, easy, what do artisans need to do to keep up with this changing pace, changing lifestyles, changing habits to be successful in their businesses and as an entrepreneur? So Shoshana, may I request you to go first?
Sure, very happy to. And I do have half an hour, but I'll be sorry to leave you all then. Yes, if what we're talking about is change, seasonal fashion, changing trends, etc., I think that design is so important. I don't know if anyone else on this call gets the very annoying comment from funders or supporters or whatever who say, what the artisans make is wonderful. All they need is a bit of marketing, which totally misses the complication of the entire supply chain and everything else. So if we're talking about that change, the reality is that the people who have customers, designers, buyers, companies, brands, know their customer. And unless an artisan is going to learn the trends and the price points and seasonality simultaneously of New York, London, Tokyo, Dubai, etc., which is a total impossibility. If we're talking about export, then collaborations are key, and working with brands and designers and clients who know who their customer is, and they get to decide whether they're going purples or flowers, or whether they need to make a jump up in price point or down in price point. So I think my answer to the change question is about design and collaborations with people who know their customers and who provide a route to market.
Thank you for that. Sreya, do you want to add?
I echo what has been put forward, but I also feel that moving ahead, it is amply clear that the need of the hour necessitates a revisiting of traditional approaches towards artisanal employment and livelihoods, that there is a need to redefine the mechanics of work with artisans and entrepreneurs and look at promoting well-grounded, economically and environmentally sustainable models of social business and enterprise as a way ahead. increasing access to, new revenue streams. In India, for example, the CSR Act for Social Accountability, the encouraging of effective public-private mixes have all been posited as relevant strategies for a more sustainable, long-standing approach. But what this has also meant is a stricter regimen of financial accountability and sustainability from artisans and enterprises undertaking crafts and ancillary work with this new financing. The clear expectation that there will be returns in terms of measured social and economic development against every single rupee invested. So therein lies the crux of the challenge. I feel that an artisan, while continuing his skills and his craft practice, also needs to be aware and cognizant of the larger economy within which he or she is functioning. In India also, we have the challenge that there is no enumeration of artisan-based data in the country. And that makes for a very, very poor case of uncontested economic value of artisanal work in the sector. So how do you also as an artisan manage to locate yourself in this changing economic, social environment? I think is a clear challenge ahead for us.
Thank you, Sreya. Duda, would you like to go next?
Yes, I think that with globalization comes the concept of modernization. And with that comes the idea that the new is better than the old. And at least in my country, the traditional techniques are disappearing because one of the reasons is that they are not correctly valued. And this has as a result that the new generations, they don't want to learn the traditional techniques because they don't see in them the possibility to improve their quality of life. And one of the challenges of the globalization is that it forces the artisans to compete with large mass consumer markets, with high volume and production at low prices. And it is very difficult, at least for the artisans in El Salvador, to meet their production needs with quality and on time, to access credit and all of above. The most difficult thing for them is to place their products in their market. The artisans cannot access global marketing channels because they don't know how to manage social media or technology. However, at the same time, there is a growing market that values this uniqueness and quality. And this is where the craft and the artisans play a very important role. And this is where we see an opportunity through the beautiful symbiosis, as Shoshana was saying also, between a designer and an artisan, and how one can complement the other. You know, the artisan with an extraordinary rich technique and that gives added value to the product, and the designer with a fresh vision of trends and knowledge of the market demands. In our case, this is the way that we do. I'm a craft designer, and we have partnered with traditional techniques, with artisans who do the traditional techniques. And sometimes we train them on how to do the traditional techniques because they have disappeared already here.
Thank you, Luna. I'll just follow up with your chain of thought there. This is to all the panelists once again. Throughout this experience of organizing this Global Eco Artisan Awards, as much as we wanted to reach out to the most rural of rural artisans, we were unable to do so simply because there are so many barriers there, right? Technology being one, language being the other. There were so many different constraints. So I'm wondering whether there is a different strategy that we require for rural artisans to really bring them up to speed versus the urban artisans. And what are your thoughts on that? Perhaps an added question there is, what are some of the things that your particular organizations are doing in the two different strategies that we might have to adopt for rural and urban artisans? Anybody?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. And in the way of background from my perspective, So we work in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, which is Jordan and Syria. And so access is I mean, there is no one further away from our markets than, an Afghan woman living in rural Bamyan in Afghanistan in the middle of a conflict. And equally true, trapped in Rakhine right now, weavers making these wonderful face masks in Myanmar, in Rakhine. So yes, I think absolutely. I mean, language is incredibly important to making those connections, and people don't speak the language of their markets. If we're talking about export, which does bring a significant, and just to pause on that point for a second, because I think it's so important, we work with artisans to sell domestically and export, but I might just draw attention to something that's in the chat box. Hedvig Alexander is with us, who runs Powered by People, and they just did a phenomenal study with Mastercon Foundation on the creative manufacturing and handmade economy. And first of all, some incredible stats, so you should read it and use it to advocate for this sector, because what Lauren was saying, what Rebecca was saying before about the power of this sector to transform the lives of so many people that we care about, from women in very rural settings the majority of our artisans are or have at some point in their life been refugees or displaced from their home, right? So using those stats is so incredibly important. But one of the things in that report is about the difference in income when you get to export. That may be the statement of the blindingly obvious, but the fact is that, we learned very quickly in Afghanistan that Afghanistan was not going to win a race to the bottom. So we weren't talking about low quality, low price point objects. It just wasn't possible. Afghanistan doesn't have the cost space for it. So we found, by necessity, but I'm pretty happy we did, the global sort of ethical, sustainable goods market, or as this report describes a different group, the creative manufacturing and handmade. This is a $500 million industry that's growing hugely, and which demands all the things that people on this call care about. Demands living wages, demands sustainability in a number of ways, from wages to conditions to environmental sustainability, demands no child labor, and values authenticity. It wants to know. I mean, Lulu, I couldn't agree with you more. We're a cultural preservation organization. I exist to make sure that the motifs and the traditions and the patterns and the rituals around them continue to exist and are passed to the next generation. So this, and it is an export market. This market is so important for artisans to access because it creates all those things and a much higher income. So sorry, I'm going on. To answer your question about the rural, there's an even farther divide between that market and the rural. So for us, that's about us just existing in country. I mean, I live outside of those countries, but my 400 staff all live in those countries. And it's about, we basically support artisans throughout the value chain. So for a group of weavers who do not speak any English in rural Rakhine, or then when they leave Rakhine and actually are in an IDP camp outside of Yangon in Myanmar, we will support them where they are with whatever they need, all the way to a much larger business where someone speaks a bit of English and can run their social media. And we're looking at market connections, some social media support and some growth support, et cetera. So our answer is that we do whatever's needed.
Thank you, Shoshana. Sreya?
Yeah, if I can come in here, I'd like to kind of look at the COVID pandemic as an opportunity that we kind of tried to take advantage of here at AIACA by seeing how digital skilling could help effectively bridge the interface between rural and urban artisans and consumers. We wanted to kind of build on these statistics that said that the number of internet users in India are slated to reach about 800 million, and that 87% of Indians were already regular users, of which 200 million resided in rural areas. 97% of users across the internet had access to the internet via mobile phone. In our experiences with rural craft producers and artisans that we worked with across the country, we found that navigating the digital marketplace effectively for them was very challenging. concrete steps needed to be taken to make this integration hassle-free with appropriate components for training, capacity building, especially for the smaller artisan segment. We've seen also that post-COVID, there's been this rush towards digital onboarding. And in this glut, we've seen that larger and more established craft enterprises occupy a more regular space on e-commerce platforms, with the same names being given visibility and access repeatedly. Smaller artisans also find it challenging to negotiate favorable terms with e-commerce aggregators owing to strict onboarding guidelines, high margins being charged, and the lack of attention to their product story being given as against the other competition on their platforms. Hence, we took this as an opportunity to kind of introduce the AIACA app, which was a mobile interface that was aimed at reaching out to all our members and network partners with resources, information, online technical sessions, tutorials, facilitate artisans to become much more easy in their interactions over a digital interface, and also focused on delivering specific technical sessions on how one could navigate the digital landscape better, with a focus on smaller artisans across the rural areas. It's too early to say whether these efforts will really bear fruit, particularly since we've seen that the experience with e-com platforms recently has not been very remunerative. But we are hopeful that as far as digital skilling efforts are concerned, I think this is a long-term strategy that will help link rural artisans better to national and global spaces.
Thank you, Sreya. Dula?
Yeah, in our way, we are kind of the link between the production and the market and the design. So our artisans are far away of using technology to sell their products. So we are beginning to train the new generations on that. But the way we work right now is that when I begin to work with a group of women in a rural area, I see around I make a research and see what they have around as natural resources or natural materials. And then I design and develop a line of products, and I train them on how to use those materials and how to produce the products with those materials when they don't have any natural resources, because in a lot of cases, this is the case, they don't have anything around. We use a lot of waste materials like fish scales, tire tubes, or anything that we can find around. And I do the same process. I design and train them on how to do those designs. And then and a lot of times we train them on how to do traditional techniques. And it can take us a year to train them on how to do the traditional weaving. But for us, it's very important to really rescue those traditions that give us an identity as a country. And so when we have the production, then we are the ones who are selling them in the national, in the international markets. But through going, this kind of activity has helped them, has helped us empower them economically, because we do all this under fair trade conditions. We really, my aim is them to really improve their lives with what they are doing, so they earn 4 times more with what their husbands does in the rural areas. So they become the main providers of their homes, and that allows them to take the important decisions in their lives, like sending their kids to school or giving them a better health care. And this is so beautiful to see, you know, to see them how they are empowered, and they decide to send their children to school, which is something really important for me. And all the women that work with us are sending their kids to school. When the norm here is when they are 10 years old, they drop school and they go and work the fields with their fathers, and the girls go and stay home and take care of their siblings. And I gladly can say that all the children from the women that work with us are sending their kids to high school also. And these kids are dreaming about becoming engineers or doctors or anything, you know, they now dream. That's the important thing, you know, that they really have a better way of seeing life in a positive way, that they have the opportunity now. And also something really important that is happening to these young women is that they don't aspire to migrate to States anymore. We have a lot of migration from El Salvador to States. Around 300 people try to migrate to States every day. And that brings like a separation of the families, and in this disruption of the families it's a lot of social problems begins, you know, when you separate the mothers from the babies, or from the when a mother migrates to a city to get a job, or migrate to another country to get a job and to have opportunity for their children, they left their children alone at home with other relatives. And I think there is where a lot of the problems, that social problems that we now have, are because of that. So what we are trying to do is to bring them the opportunity to have a job where they live, and the opportunity for them to stay with their kids, and you know, have and put on those kids the foundation of love and the foundations of the human being that they will become in the future. And this is something really, really nice. That we can see it's happening, you know, and through the economic impact that we're giving, that they have been able to build their homes. They don't have to live in the same room with other families, and this brings a sense of belonging to them and a sense of pride and dignity that is really, really nice. We also focus on training them on how to do positive education with their children. And this allows them to break all the cycles of violence that they already have, that, you know, that they are passing through one generation to another.
Thank you, Lula.
Vaishali, if I can just interject, you know, there's some very interesting data that was being circulated in the sector that points to about in India, about 30% of the rural artisanal skill base depleting over the last 30 years. And this was very, very alarming for us, because A, did it indicate that young people were no longer willing to consider craft as a first choice vocation? B, was there a depreciation in the kind of craft skills that we were seeing being handed from one generation to another? But the interesting thing with COVID also was that we are increasingly hearing stories of younger craftspeople who had migrated to cities in search of more aspirational jobs, a better urban living, coming back because of the way that they were treated in these cities when lockdown happened. And we've all heard in India about the long march back home, and of the reluctance of these artisans and craftspersons to now live on in cities, carry on unremunerative, unskilled labor, and be treated as second-class citizens. The challenge for us is that the artisans come back and they don't look at rejoining the traditional craft process as a last resort, but they are engaged and they are motivated to rejoin their traditional craft practices because they view this as a legitimate, honest, dignified way of living. And I think this is where the whole concept of looking at artisanal business not merely as a survival strategy, but as an asset building strategy for this constituency comes into focus all the more.
That's some excellent stats, Shreya. So I'll just follow up with a question there, right? Having worked with artisans globally, what are your top 3 advice for artisans who really want to stop being job seekers but job givers and turn them really have this entrepreneurial spirit coming up? What would your top 3 advice be for them?
Okay, that's a difficult one, but I think one is that recognition of the value, the key value proposition of handmade in a global economy that is opening up despite the collapse of markets. And we know that there are very dismal forecasts in terms of what exports will bring in this year, and also in terms of declining consumer sentiment and consumer fatigue the world over in the light of the pandemic. But we have seen that the value of handcrafted goods is something that persists. It has sustained, it has remained a constant in this ever-changing dynamic market environment. I think very important for artisans, entrepreneurs to recognize that the world over there is a market and a demand for such products. Increasingly also recognize that they are part of a green economy. What they essentially do, the practices that they undertake, and the localization of the economy that they often operate within, make them prime candidates for sustainable, environmental friendly business. We have data to suggest that 70% of Indian exports right now are to environmentally conscious markets. This is a huge, huge advantage for artisans and entrepreneurs to leverage here in India. I wanted to also talk about the process of certification that my organization is involved in, Craftmark, where we look at building economic and social parameters to certify and authenticate the genuineness of handmade craft processes in India. To leverage the environmental soundness of craft practices that we see here, we are seeking at adding a third handle, an environmental angle, to certify processes as being Craftmark green. Because we see essentially this is a huge opportunity for artisans and entrepreneurs to place themselves firmly in the global landscape here in India. So I think these are the top two. I think the other thing is the ability to also pivot and scale, and to understand that by pivoting and scaling does not necessarily amount to a diminishing of or a trivializing of their traditional craft practice. I think what we've understood in our work with certification also is that certification cannot be cast in stone. Craft practices are dynamic processes that evolve with time. They migrate across different contexts. They are adopted by different communities. And for artisans and entrepreneurs to be aware of the vibrancy and the mobility that this kind of medium affords. I think these are my top three.
I'm so sorry to drop in. I know Shoshana is tight on time, and I just wanted to make sure, Vaishali, you had anything else to, ask her or get her insights on. Shoshana, how many minutes are we left with?
So I just have a hard stop exactly at 9:30, really. So I'm really happy to jump off at 9:29.
So that means we have how many minutes left? 9 minutes. Okay. So, okay, Vaishali, we've got 9 minutes. If we could, get some airtime for Shoshana, that would be awesome. And then just overall for the panel, we've got about 12 minutes left and some Q&A. All right.
Thanks, Saloni. Shoshana, but it would be great to hear about what advice you would have for these guys. What would the top 3 things be on your list?
Absolutely. So I suppose, everything that Sreya said, I totally agree with. And if what we're talking about is people who want to be job creators, as you said, not just job seekers, and that's not everyone. I mean, I think one of the things that I've learned over the last 15 years or so is that, it's true with all of us that not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. I mean, that is a very particular mindset, a driving hunger to grow and innovate, etc. And then there are more creative minds who don't love the business side of things and the growth side of things, but really may want to innovate creatively. And then there are people who want to work and not want to do any of those things. So I think that's an important recognition to have. But if we're talking about those people who do want to be entrepreneurs, I think that growing a business means you need more customers. And obviously, I feel that the export part of that's important. I think Sreya talked about, how much of Indian exports going to green buyers. I think that's all very, very important. It is an inefficient way to do it if you're trying to learn it all on your own. because it's a big old world out there. And so my first point of advice would be to find the group or the person in your city or country or town who does have this knowledge and connections. There are artisan support groups in every corner of this earth. So there will be people, better and worse, but there will be people who can sit down and talk to you about standards, about fireproofing, about, dye poison, about conditions, about which markets require what. And those people usually also will support on the other things that you need to grow, which are about, formalizing your accounts at times. If I think about, just to try to make it tangible, if I think about Saida, who is a jeweler from Afghanistan, who I've known for a long time and knew her when she began at our institute when she was about 18, went through for 3 years, and she graduated as an incredibly skilled jeweler. She doesn't have any customers. She doesn't really have any cash. She doesn't have a workshop. She has a set of tools. But how do you go from, and Saida is someone who wants to run a business and be a job creator, right? So how do you go from an artisan with a knowledge of what's out there and a great skill set to an entrepreneur? So what that looks like for Saida is incubation space. Before you can pay rent on a place, it's helpful so this is also to what our organization does to support that, is small space while you're growing until you can get your own. Access to larger machines. While you may have the hand tools, there are sometimes need for larger machines. But again, in many places that can be used. People provide that resource. But then it's about, we have something called the Design Center, which is a place and an institution that enables an artisan to come in and look at the art history of the region, motifs, color, materials, but also looks at product development, pricing, and everything else. So I think first piece of advice is really about, main piece of advice is really about finding that resource around you, not trying to invent the wheel, and use the help to grow.
Thanks, Shoshana. I know you have very limited time, so I'm just going to go to the Q&A section quickly because I'd love the audience to engage with some of their questions as well. The first question is from Amar, and the question is there an opportunity to create a utility to support artisans with running generic business operations? It could be accounting, logistics, supply chain. This would really help lower the costs for artisans to operate. If you guys know of any,
like funding support or
no, so a utility support. So do you know of any platforms or utility support systems that can help artisans run the operations bit, like accounting, logistics, supply chain? Those are also huge operational side to the business, right? Managing a good business.
Right. There are several of these startups here in India that have suddenly accelerated post-pandemic, that encourage the running of accounts and streamlining of inventory through a mobile app. And I'd be happy to put that information in the chat box for them to connect and see if any collaboration is possible. I think a lot of the inputs related to logistic and supply chain management, also interesting inputs that are being provided through acceleration and interesting accelerators and incubators. I'll put that information in the chat box. There are a couple of apps and there are a couple of acceleration programs.
That would be great.
I might just jump in and next, and thank you for your patience, everyone. So again, I'm going to say Hedvig, who, if this is true, Hedvig, you put it in the chat box. She's actually creating a platform specifically for artisans globally, which is about production management and all of that. Because one of the things that we've found when we've worked together in Afghanistan and elsewhere is that there isn't a bit of software. There isn't anything that works for the artisan industry off the shelf. It's not there. And so she's creating that and has. We've worked with something called Stati before, but yeah, we really found trouble in that. So I think it needs to be artisan-specific resources. So what Sreya is talking about and what Hedvig has can be really helpful.
Shoshana, do we have 2 more minutes to take one question, which is so apt for you right now? Yeah.
Take all the time.
All right. There's a question from Zanetti, and the question is how to ensure that it is really a fair collaboration between artisans and designers so that artisans do not become the workforce of designers.
Yeah.
I think it also goes back to, I don't know whether you joined Bandana's keynote, but she talks about credit, compensation, and I think there was one more thing, but I couldn't get that, but credit, compensation, and consent of the artisans, right? Quick thoughts on question.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I had seen that question before and wanted to talk to it. Yeah, incredibly important. I mean, so I think, okay, in order to make a relationship that works for everyone, that needs to work for the artisan and it needs to work for the buyer. Mm-hmm. If a quote or an offer is made that actually doesn't work for the buyer's business, it never happens anyway. So that's a nothing. So we have to understand that a buyer has to be able to, it has to be at a price point that buyer can absorb and deal with. Now, there's a lot around that we need to fix and push on. Payment terms, for example. We need to make sure that people are getting money up front or that they can access financing, often without collateral, that can allow them to do work before they get paid, or they get paid half in advance. But I think the important thing there is that artisans need to quote what works for them. And we have found that there's a role in helping there, because pricing things is complicated, right? Making sure that you add in the depreciation of your machinery, all the labor costs, your utilities, right? It's a complex thing. It's an art and a science, learning to price things. But so long as an artisan is quoting an amount that does allow their business to survive, cover their costs, and grow, that feels fair to me in a transactional sense. But then the last point, I think, is about honoring traditions, which is that, and this is where I think that those who want to be involved in design from the artisan side, it's a lifetime process of being a designer and learning your own style and learning your reference points. So it's not like something you do over 6 months and then you're a designer. But we have to push into that. And artisans need, some of them, to be those designers and be those translations between other designers and collaborations. Because yes, I want to see more brands working with artisans, but not just as the labor force. The way we do it is that we have, let's say, designers from Jordan and artisans from Jordan. And we work to map out what those motifs are and what those techniques are that come from, for example, the Damascene mother of pearl inlay tradition. So when a designer and a brand comes to us and says, we want to make decorative household items, we say, okay, here's what we offer. This is the set of motifs. These are the traditions. These are the techniques that we're good at. If you want something else, go somewhere else. But if you're interested in that, let's co-design something. And then you have the respect for honoring of and sort of spotlighting of that tradition, but you also get some cool innovation, which is ultimately a conversation in person or over Zoom between a buyer / designer, an artisan / designer, and maybe a translator. And that's how I found it works best.
Thank you so much for that. I'll just take one last question. Lula, this is for you.
And I'm so sorry to hog this spotlight.
Thank you so much for joining. We'll be in touch.
Great to see you all. Thank you.
I just want to add something, if I may, to what Shoshana was saying. It's like like we have to picture, or we have to begin to do like horizontal projects where all the parts involved are equally important. In that situation, it's a win-win situation for everyone. And those are the sustainability projects that really last long in time.
All right. I have one final question, and I'll direct it to you, Lula, probably because you have the most experience in that. This is a question from Matjis. How can small design studios connect with craft people? It's not easy to connect if we are not physically close or even speak the language. What's been your experience?
My experience is I just work with communities of women from my country. And it's, even though I speak the language and I'm here in the country, and it's a very small country, it's difficult for me. It's always difficult to work with communities of artisans, because the first thing that you need to know or to understand is the way they think. The cultural part is really, really important. Artisans are not machines that you go and say, hey, this is my design, and then you put one button and then they produce it. You, in my experience, the first thing that you have to do as a designer is to really connect with the artisans, to really have a relationship before producing anything. You have to build a trust relationship between them and you. You have to trust them and they have to trust you. And after achieving that, you will be able to have a proper communication and a proper relationship that will allow you to really produce and make beautiful things, you know. But my advice will be, if you choose any, you can search where the artisans are on internet, or you can choose one area in America or Central America, that we are in Central America, or in India. There are a lot of groups of artisans everywhere, but you have to understand first what's behind that group of artisans, what's the human part involved in all this process.
Thank you so much. I've been prompted by the organizers that our time is up. I know the topic is so vast. There is so much to cover, but this was just the beginning of the conversation that we needed to have. To all the artisans present here with us, we will share more follow-up notes, make connections wherever possible. Sreya and Lula, thank you so much for joining us. Please do stay back. We have some excellent lineup of speakers next as well, but the award ceremony as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.